So let's start with the first part of political culture, civil society. What is civil society and why is it important? When we talk about civil society, we're talking about the presence of private voluntary organizations or associations. These are associations that are formed to pick up slack where the state is failing. When you've got national political institutions that are unwilling or unable to address needs of the people. They develop based on how individuals relate to each other and society. Social capital or associationalism is this propensity of individuals to form or join organizations spontaneously. And they can act as checks on the government. They don't have to be political per se. Okay? And the classic example that I like to use is like the UMBC chess team. People come together to play chess. Oh, actually, that's not a good classic. Oh, man, that's fine. They come together to play chess. Our chess team is just really good, which is why it's not the average sort of civil society organization. But they come together to play chess. But what else are they doing besides playing chess? Well, one of the things that they're doing is they're literally coming together and they're talking about stuff. Hey, Joe. Hey, Jan. How's it going? Oh, pretty good. How was your morning? Oh, my morning was pretty crappy. Well, why was your morning pretty crappy? Well, because it snowed and we had 2 inches of snow and Maryland's never ready for snow but it's especially bad in Baltimore County and it's especially bad in my town. Oh, really? Why is it so bad in your town? And then Jan says, well, it's so bad in my town because they never plow our street. My street's never plowed. And oh, where do you live? Oh, I live in Arbutus. You know what? I live in Arbutus too. And you know what? My street never gets plowed either. Oh, where do you live? I live on this side. I live on this side. And this is really long, but to make this really long story short, they end up talking essentially about politics. Well, it's because our local government sucks. Our mayor sucks. How come they can't organize themselves to do these sorts of things? So this is the sort of crux of civil society, what civil society is supposed to do. Now, how did the Soviet system affect civil society? Well, think about it. The Soviet system went out of its way to destroy horizontal links between people. So you don't have Jan and John or Jack or whoever I just said sitting around talking about these things. They're going to come together. If they're in the chess club, they're going to come together and play chess and bam, they're gone. So what was special then about Central Asia? Well, I've mentioned this before. Horizontal links were not smashed to the same extent as in European parts of the Soviet Union. This was largely because people were linked in with their family, these extended kinship networks. Even in Russia, people spoke freely to their families, Russia being the sort of hub of the Soviet Empire, where the KGB was arguably most active. But people would speak in their family structures, which were much smaller than in Central Asia. The extended family may or may not have been trusted, but in Central Asia, the network is there. It's much larger. So you've got a potential network which is much larger. You also have loosely organized social networks that exist throughout the Soviet period, and these are actually networks that have evolved and that have existed before the Soviet period as well. For example, the mahallas and the chaikonas. The mahallas I think I've mentioned before. These are these neighborhood organizations that help in a variety of ways. They help to keep order. They're led by local leaders. They also help to distribute social goods and social services. And so in the Soviet Union, they were the eyes and the ears of the Soviet state to a certain extent, but they also were regarded as long-held social institutions, and they were a way that people continued to relate with each other on a very local basis, which involved kinship networks, but also between kinship networks. You also had the chaikonas. It's literally tea shop, but they're basically cafes. These are places where people would come and they would sit around and they would drink tea and talk just like they did 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So they were places where people would gather. Now, both of these organizations, the mahallas and the chaikonas, were male-oriented. They were male-dominated. Women can't come to the chaikonas, for example. But there was a buffer zone between the state and the citizens. The citizens had their own places within each one of these. You also had Western-style NGOs with independence. NGOs are a tough thing because this is almost a substitute for real organized civil society. where these hierarchical organizations come in, and they create these organizations that represent their people. So, for example, a couple people can call themselves an organization, and they can go out and they can apply for Western grants. But questions quickly emerge as to how representative they are for their people and how effective they're going to be. Frequently, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, they gear their activities towards Western donors. This is logical because these are the people who are giving them money. But they do this at the expense of losing their own potential base. So another example that I like to give is the environmental movement, which was so important in parts of Central Asia and the Soviet Union in terms of creating a civil society towards the end of the 1980s. But if you think about how this movement can evolve within the context of Western-style NGOs, imagine an organization that comes together to fight, I don't know, incinerators, right? So they come together because they don't like these incinerators in their backyard. They pollute, they do whatever. And then they look for Western money to keep the organization going because you need to dedicate yourself to the organization. You need funding to do that because you're not going to be working somewhere else. And so they apply, but their Western counterparts say, hey, look, this is great. We love these sorts of environmental organizations. But if you really want a chance of actually gaining a grant, then we really highly suggest that you tailor this more towards the programs that we're supporting right now, which are, for example, anti-nuclear programs, right? Anti-nuclear reactors or something. And so these guys scratch their heads and say, well, okay, I mean, that's part of it too. And so they change their whole agenda. And then they get the grant, and lo and behold, they're no longer representing the incinerator movement, which was popularly supported, right? All their friends and family and friends of friends were really against the incinerators, but now they're talking about something which is a little more distant, these nuclear reactors, which don't even really affect this region. And this estranges them from their sort of base. And so this is commonly something that happens with Western-style NGOs. Opposition parties are, of course, even more of a lost cause because they're seen as a clearer threat to political elites, and therefore they're even more thoroughly repressed. So Western-style NGOs and opposition parties really become lost. But you do have greater horizontal links, but horizontal links that have been cut. You've got loosely organized social networks, but social networks that have in some ways been compromised, especially the mahallas, where people have been monitored. So these things exist, but they exist as sort of roots and not well-formed civil societies. So the second aspect, let me see where we are in time. Oh, we got more time. I'll go right back. Oh, sorry. There we go. The second aspect here is civic identity. So even if you have people going out and talking in the chaihonas, there's a hierarchy that's clear. Standing out in Central Asian political culture is not necessarily seen as a positive. In these cultures and in many non-Western cultures, individualism is frowned upon. The good of the community is key. And this often leads to misunderstandings in human rights. What we see as violations of individual rights of people in these communities might be seen as a guarantee on the rights of the community. If you stand back and look at the existing form of relations, again, the hierarchy is clear. There's a hierarchy that limits the utility of homegrown Central Asian civil society from serving the purposes that we ascribe to civil society. In other words, checking the state. Because the state is supposed to be helping all of us. It's not about me sticking up for myself. So look at the Chaihona. It's composed of men. And the Mahala, you've got men who have links to authorities and who are by their own by their nature really authorities. The people in charge of the Mahala are authorities. They're historically responsible for maintaining order locally and carrying out the instructions of authorities. They're part of both quote unquote the people and also the system. And it's a social norm that these Oksokols who I mentioned before, these white beards, older people, are respected. Their positions are adhered to. And they give back to the community as well by providing funds for people who are destitute, for example. For example, if you want to have a wedding, you have to have a lot of money, and so they gather money enough for you to have a wedding. But mahalas are not the appropriate place to find challenges to the system. They're not generally a place of free-flowing conversation and political debate. And again, they're much more associated to the collective versus the individual. So if we're talking about democratization, if we're talking about checking the state from this perspective, then all these things run against the hierarchical political culture, the links between these organizations, especially the mahalas, the social networks, and the government, and then the focus on collective versus individual freedoms. Now I'll take a separate set of slides and we'll talk about the nature of clans.